This is the story of Kenya Airlines Flight 431. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you like the videos that I make, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. On the night of the 30th of January 2000, an Airbus A310 flown by Kenya Airlines prepares to take off from Abidjan. The plane had just diverted from Lagos. The conditions at Lagos were less than ideal for a safe landing, and thus the crew had decided to divert. Nigerians used this flight to head to Dubai for duty-free shopping, so I imagined that this flight was especially popular. Today, the plane had 10 crew members and 169 passengers on board. They were flying from Abidjan Airport to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. The flight was all but routine up to this point. The plane and the crew had done everything as they were supposed to. All seemed normal. On the ground at Abidjan Airport, the crew was getting ready to taxi, and at 9:07 p.m. they were cleared to taxi. The pilot cycled through their routines, going from checklist to checklist, making sure that the plane was properly configured for takeoff. At 9:07 and 45 seconds, the crew read back their clearance to the tower. The tower didn't know it yet, but this would be the last time they'd hear from Flight 431. Flight 431 was cleared for takeoff. All was good. The captain, who was the non-flying pilot, applied takeoff power to the engines. And with a sound that I assume we're all familiar with, the engines roared to life. The twin engines propelled the giant airliner down the runway at Abidjan Airport. 38 seconds after the engines were brought up to full power, they lifted off. The captain called out "positive," meaning that they were climbing normally. The co-pilot followed with "positive rate, gear up." But before the captain could raise the landing gear, the stall warning comes on. The co-pilot, out of sheer instinct, pushes the control column forward as he should in such conditions. When the stall warning sounds, it's letting the pilots know that the plane is dangerously close to stalling. The pilots are confused, but they push the column forward. The co-pilot asks, "What's the problem?" Stalls during takeoffs were rare, and this warning had caught them off guard. The radio altimeter chimes in, 200. They were just 200 feet above the ocean. The automated voice counts down the altitude, 100, 50, 40, 30. The captain, realizing that the plane was about to crash, calls out, "Go up!" But at 30 feet above the ocean, they were out of options. Seconds after taking off, Kenya Airlines Flight 431 had crashed. Within seconds, the controller realizes what has happened and he presses the alarm. Within 10 minutes, rescue personnel were at the crash site. The smell of kerosene permeated the air around the crash site, and boats maneuvered in that direction. They found 7 people in the water. 1 person swam 1.2 miles to shore. 10 people had survived the accident. Talking to the witnesses of the crash, they soon realized that Flight 431 had lost altitude shortly after taking off. They could do little but speculate until the black boxes were retrieved. Once the investigators had their hands on the black boxes, they could listen to what happened in the cockpit of Flight 431. They were surprised to hear a stall warning this early on in the flight. Stalls during takeoffs are incredibly rare, so rare in fact that pilots hadn't even trained for it. Warnings during takeoffs are to be dealt with after having gained sufficient amount of altitude. But a stall warning does not allow the pilot to do this. In fact, most stall training to the pilots had been geared towards cruises and approach phases of flight. No one had thought of a stall happening during takeoff, apparently. The first thing investigators had to figure out was the authenticity of the warning. They had 2 scenarios. 1, the warning was authentic and the plane was actually stalling. 2, it was a false alarm. Even though a stall during takeoff was rare, they pulled up a few scenarios that would cause an airplane to stall during takeoff. This included the uncommanded retraction of the slats, the uncommanded deployment of the thrust reversers, and the uncommanded deployment of the spoilers. One by one, the investigators worked through each scenario. They had the cockpit data recorder and visuals of the wreckage from the seabed, and they eliminated all of the possibilities. The warning, then it seems, was a false alarm. A false alarm with very real consequences. A false stall warning can be triggered by a multitude of things, from faulty sensors to incorrect speed calculation by the flight computer. But what sealed the plane's fate was how the pilots reacted to the warning. Could they have known that this was a false warning? The QRH, or the Quick Reference Handbook, asks the pilots to pull the corresponding circuit breakers in the case of a false alarm, but in the seconds that the plane was airborne, they just didn't have the time to diagnose the issue. To quote the report, quote, "His immediate action on the control column was in accordance with the procedures specified by the airline." End quote. The co-pilot fully expected the warning to go away as he pushed the nose forward and as the plane gained airspeed. When it didn't, he still kept up the pressure on the control column. But at the height and speed that they were moving at, a small movement is all that's necessary for the aircraft to start descending. The report goes on to say that the pilot flying had a multitude of information sources like speed trend bar, and engine thrust to deduce that the warning was a false one. If any pilots are listening to this, I'd really like to know if you'd be able to deduce that the warning was false from just these performance parameters and in the time that they had. One thing that could have saved the crew was the GPWS, or the Ground Proximity Warning System. The system is supposed to let the pilot know when the plane is dangerously low with an audible warning, but the CVR never indicated that the warning was ever activated. The pilots were not aware of their extremely low altitude until the captain calls out, "Go up!" a few seconds before impact. The GPWS might have saved the plane. Digging into the Airbus's documents, they discovered that the GPWS warning was suppressed by the stall warning. In other words, the GPWS warning didn't sound because the stall warning was active, as the stall warning takes priority over GPWS. Listening to the CVR again, they hear a 50 millisecond blip, a blip that sounds like the first 50 milliseconds of the GPWS warning. This was practically inaudible to the crew. The cause of the false alarm was never determined due to the wreckage being under the water. The investigators never got to study it. They speculate that the flight warning computer had malfunctioned on takeoff. Ultimately, the false alarm forced the crew to put the aircraft into a highly unsafe situation. Then the pilots lost track of their altitude, and the black ocean did not give them any visual cues about their dangerous descent. 169 people lost their lives on that fateful night. Thank you for listening to this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. I hope you enjoyed listening to this as much as I did making it. Thank you. All of the great footage that you just saw was courtesy of Plane Spotting Berlin. If you loved what you saw, head on over to Plane Spotting Berlin. Links are in the description.